Some questions for the proposition. Sam.
Is it not the case that given that humans are animals which can imagine the future, and imagine a future in which they perhaps don't know what's going to happen, they have to explain that life, and therefore they're all confronted by questions of what is valuable and what we ought to value in life, what's meaningful, and therefore these questions have to be to some extent prior to scientific questions, in the sense of scientific questions, while they're interesting in themselves, can only take one part of a kind of broader approach to how we live and how we organise society, and therefore science is to some extent a means to this end, although it is interesting in itself.
That's a long question. The reason I'm thinking a little bit about it is that clearly science is. I mean, your aspect is essentially separating values from science, and essentially, in some sense, your values. There's interesting integration. Can you understand? There's two questions. How are values created? Okay, essentially, can we understand values? I mean, can we actually? Does science have a strong impact on values? As an impact on values, I think the previous speakers have already said that science has a limited impact on morality. Many of us will say medics do morality. I mean, natural scientists often don't do morality very well. Okay, we are moral in a certain sense, but science itself is not a moral subject. So it doesn't have a strong impact on values to that level. We do try to understand how values in society develop. I mean, some of my colleagues more call it altruism. Actually, I mean, it's quite nice. You can write down in quite mathematical physical models how altruism works in society, and actually you can describe it quite well. So I'm not sure whether that answers probably part of your question. It doesn't make any judgment whether science is more valuable than arts or humanities, because arts and humanities, I mean, the values you're talking about essentially predates your arts and humanities as well. So essentially, I'm not sure how far we can go with that question. I mean,
I think science is morally neutral, and it doesn't aim to give you a way of being right. It aims to give you a way of being less wrong, and that is all it promises. I do think there is something in that humility which can actually transfer to political debate and discourse and to discussions of what is right and wrong. So that is as far as I would go.
Yeah, I think the other aspect is science is strongly evidence-based, and I think that part of the scientific method has entered humanities quite strongly as well these days. I mean, the whole method debate that was in the social scientists in probably 60s, 70s, that time, was exactly that. It was the method that was developed by the natural sciences moving into the social sciences, and it made an enormous splash for a good reason, because it's the right way to approach some problems, but not all of them.
We'll do a come back here.
No, I just want to add something to what you said, which is that more recently people have seen the limitations of using the scientific method in social science, in large part because the very subjects in which you are doing your investigation of are people who can interpret things in the way you're doing it, unlike with physical objects. So it reached its limits fairly quickly as a method for doing social science that provided the same kind of results that we had in the natural sciences.
Oh, they're not identical. I mean, there's nothing I'm trying to say, but the transfer was that way, not the other way around. I mean, that's the point I was trying to make.
Thank you. Questions for the opposition? Yes, what's your name?
Charlotte. You yourself, in your speech, said that we've been discussing things about, morality since the time of Plato and Aristotle. I think it would be fair to say that discussions in science have made a lot more progress, and therefore we're discussing different things. So what would you say in response to, like, you haven't made any progress? And also, it's a kind of controversial theory, obviously, but kind of the logical positivist idea in that you're not making progress because what you're talking about is just meaningless.
Good. Yes, that's clearly raised against the standard moral and political philosophers of the ages, that we seem to be still arguing the footnotes of Plato's Republic. We seem not to have moved on beyond that. I think that's probably unfair in that we're moving towards a greater and greater consensus in the moral and in the political field. For example, democracy, which was something that started with the Greeks, is now more or less ubiquitously accepted as the way in which human beings ought to be found in society. Right. Now, there's still a big debate about what we mean by democracy and what kinds of democracy and so on, but we're moving forward in that way. But it's the very nature of what we're talking about that doesn't lend to the same kind of progress in the way that science does. And that's not because science is better or because the arts are worse. It's because the subject matter is different. And we're talking about different kinds of things. I'm really not qualified to enter into this kind of a debate, and there would be much more. But on the higher realms of science, I'm pretty sure that there are controversies about what's reality and how it works. And it gets perilously close to getting back to where philosophy was. I mean, they'll be able to tell you that when you start talking about subatomic particles, or when you're starting to talk about other things that are on the edges of science, string theory or stuff like that, again, it starts to become rather more philosophical in the sense that it's less certain in the way that science claims it is. But that's okay, that's fine. I mean, we have different aspects to our lives, different aspects to who we are, to our personality, what it is to be human. And some aspects of it, we fight over it, we refine it, we go backwards, we go forwards, we do bits and pieces. That's how it is. And in science, we're moving forward. We might come to a point where we stop in science. It hasn't always been progress in that way. Sometimes you get to what couldn't call the paradigm shift, and you move on or you stop. That's fine. But the idea that somehow, because it does that, it's better than the arts or the humanities, it's just ludicrous. I mean, it's just to see a one-dimensional aspect of the world. And you're all too intelligent to do that.
Yes, if I could perhaps come in on that question as well. You know, when I was sort of thinking about this topic beforehand, you know, one of the big differences between, say, medicine and arts and humanities is that in medicine you would never read a textbook that was 10 years old. There's a sense in which, you know, yesterday's knowledge is obsolete, and the idea that sort of scientific knowledge is, you know, sort of constantly moving on. Whether or not that's true or not, I think could be you know, open to debate in and of itself. But I think there is a sort of fundamental difference in the arts and humanities that you've touched on there, namely that a text by Plato, for instance, could still be relevant in the present day, but I don't think it's necessarily relevant in the same way that it was in Plato's time. And you know, that is one of the fundamental properties of texts, that they can be reinterpreted in such a way as to be you know, relevant now. I think you know, it's not the case that sort of arts and humanities haven't changed. I think you know, modernity, the experience of modernity has you know, made for fundamental upheavals in all areas of knowledge, including the arts and humanities. And you know, one of the big differences, I suppose, is that there's no longer the respect for tradition and convention that perhaps you know, once you know, that obtained in the pre-modern era. And you know, I think, to my mind, that's one of the great you know, democratic and sort of emancipating strengths of the arts and humanities, that it's an area, a space in which, you know, sort of critical thought can flourish. And you know, I think that's one of the reasons why politically it's seen as dangerous and, you know, best stamped down.